All right, we are live on HHTV. You may begin.
Good evening. My name is Sally Renn, and I'm here as chair of the Diversity Awareness Committee. And it is my pleasure tonight to welcome all of you to our monthly program of the committee, and a warm welcome to each of you. Thank you for attending. Tonight, we're happy to present Janet Gwilym, and Janet is an immigrant attorney who manages the immigration legal services at a local refugee resettlement agency. She has nearly 30 years of experience working in the field of immigration law, with a focus on serving those most vulnerable and who need it most. That would be the ones who are refugees, asylum seekers, unaccompanied children, immigrants without documents, and survivors of trauma and trafficking. Janet earned her bachelor's degree from Stanford University and her JD degree from the University of Washington School of Law. She's an active member of the Plymouth Church, UCC in Seattle, including working with Plymouth's immigration ministry team and the Plymouth Welcome Circle, which supports a recently arrived Afghan family. Janet is the daughter of Horizon House resident Karen Gwilym. Janet's joining us to share her experiences and insights learned from her work with the Afghans evacuated from Afghanistan to the Puget Sound area since the takeover of the Afghan government by the Taliban last August 2021. She will discuss joys of walking along the learning from Afghan families, along with many unprecedented challenges faced by evacuated Afghans as they adjust to live in our region and try to support the family they've left behind. It is with great pleasure that I ask you to welcome Janice Gwilym. Janice?
Great, thank you very much. I am going to share my screen, and I have a PowerPoint here. And just let me know if you can see that. Hopefully you all can. I'm going to be talking a little bit about my work and my experiences, both personal and with the Plymouth Church and our Plymouth Welcome Circle, and the family that we have been resettling, and then also the probably hundreds of Afghans that I've been talking with over the last 9 months or so. As we've been working on resettling them in the Puget Sound, mostly King County area. To talk, let me make sure this is working. It's not advancing. Let me see. Just a second. I'm going to have to go out and see why I cannot. A little technical difficulty here. I might have to. I'm going to try that again. Okay, let's try it this way. Okay, here we go. So as Sally said, I am a member of Plymouth Church, and we have both a immigration ministry team and Mary Margaret Pruitt, who is on today as well, is a very active member of that ministry team, and she's also a member of our Plymouth Welcome Circle. And we have been very busy welcoming families both in the sanctuary movement and doing advocacy work within the faith communities for a number of years now. And Plymouth actually has a long history of doing refugee resettlement work throughout for many years. I actually grew up with one of the families that we resettled from Chile, and we went to school together, and I have pictures of us as kids and growing up, and that experience of growing up in the church with other refugee families that were being resettled led me into doing this kind of work. I have spent most of my career either working in immigration law offices. I was a paralegal for a very long time, or working for immigrant advocacy groups such as with One America, where Representative Pramila Jayapal started. And eventually I went and took the plunge and went off to law school and became an immigration attorney, and worked with unaccompanied immigrant children for a number of years. And then more recently kind of returned to my roots. I had started my career off in refugee resettlement, and I returned to Refugee Resettlement Agency this past year. And just at the same time that the Afghan evacuation had happened and the Afghans were starting to arrive from the military bases where they had been evacuated to, and coming into our own communities here. And this was kind of a return to my own roots, because back at the very beginning of my career, when I was coming out of college back in the 80s, I had one of my very first jobs was working at a place called the Afghan Center. And at that time, there had been a lot of Afghans evacuated from Afghanistan because of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. And at that time, the sort of center of Afghan life in the United States was the Bay Area and the East Bay. And I happened to be working in refugee resettlement and got to know a man who started this place called the Afghan Center that was trying to serve the needs of the Afghan refugee community there. And I was the only American working there at the time. Go forward from 1989 till now, and I returned to kind of a similar thing of all of these bewildered people coming out of Afghanistan. And I had been working at the Afghan Center when everybody was all excited because the Soviets were withdrawing and they had a lot of hope for their future, that they were going to rebuild their country. And then that was before the Taliban's first entry into the country. There's been a lot of ups and downs over the years with that. So I've seen a lot. What we're going to talk about tonight is do a real quick review of Afghanistan and its history, and then talk about the evacuation and what happened there and the fall of the government, and then move into the unique situation of how the Afghan refugee situation is very, very different than other refugee populations that have come to the United States, and the challenges that they're facing are quite different. And so the resettlement process has been very different, and how walking alongside them here has been, a different experience, but and there's also similarities. And I'm going to also describe a little bit about the Plymouth Welcome Circle's experiences. We got involved with it working with a group called Viets for Afghans, which was led by Vietnamese refugees whose families were brought here 40 years ago as refugees and wanted to give back when the Afghans were being evacuated, and share the experiences that they had and the lessons that they learned, and wanted to make it a better experience for Afghans going through it. So we'll talk about that a little bit. And I don't know if there's a way to actually ask questions in this forum. And if there is, I would love it. It's fine to interrupt me, or if we can do it at the end, that would be great too. So first of all, we're going to do a quick review of Afghan history, and very quick review because I am not an expert on Afghan history in the least. But when I was looking into it, Afghan history is very, very complicated, and it has had so many changes over, the thousands and thousands of years, ups and downs and changes and invasions and many different dynasties and conquests and people coming in and out, and the Islamic conquest when it became an Islamic region, and then more empires and the invasions into India, more dynasties, and then the British influences and the several different wars that they had with the British. And then finally, when the British left India and the partition with India and Pakistan, and how that affected Afghanistan tremendously, with Pakistan becoming a country of a very fluid border to Afghanistan. So great influences there. And then just in the last 100 years, there have been just incredible amounts of change and lots of twists and turns. So just in the last 100 years, in 1921, the British were defeated in the Third British-Afghan War, and that's when Afghanistan became an independent nation. A king came into being, and then another king came into being, and then the British did their withdrawal from from India, and then, like I said, Pakistan was created. They had a prime minister, and that's when they, in 1953, started having leanings towards communism. And over the next several decades, there was quite a bit of communist influences and partnerships, but it wasn't always pro-Soviet communism, and lots of infighting between the different communist groups. And then in 1979, the Soviets invaded in order to prop up the communist government that was there at the time. And that's when the Mujahideen rebels began uniting. The Mujahideen were trained in Pakistan by the Pakistani military, and they led the fight against the Soviet-backed Afghan army and the Soviets. And eventually they were the ones that pushed the Soviets out, and the Soviets exited in 1989. And that was the year that I was working at the Afghan Center, and when there was all of this great hope for Afghan becoming an independent country again. So finally the Mujahideen entered in 1992 and ousted the communist president and formed a new government. But then the Taliban began to rise, and in 1995 the Taliban formally took over and ruled the country, and that's when they instituted their very harsh laws against women, and I think it was 1998 when they had a 8,000 massacre against Hazara and Mazar Sharif, and just lots of really horrendous things had happened. Human rights abuses and things happened during those years, and still even the clients that come in now just talk about that crazy time and horrible living through those horrible times, and how that's their main reason that they needed to leave now. Then of course September 11th happened, and even before that Al-Qaeda was in Afghanistan and hiding and building up, and so in October 2001, the US and British troops started launching their airstrikes to get the Taliban out of Afghanistan. And that's when the US started their 20 years presence in Afghanistan. Hamid Karzai was sworn in as a leader in December of 2001 and was the president there for the next 13 years until Ashraf Ghani was elected. And then he was in power, sometimes sharing with Abdullah until April 2021, or I'm sorry, until August 2021. But in April 2021, President Biden announced that the troops would withdraw by September 11th of 2022. But we didn't quite make it till that time because the Taliban started taking over different provinces, and by August 15th, that was the official collapse of Kabul, and it came in much stronger and surprised everyone at how quickly that happened. I have had many people that I've interviewed where they were completely taken by surprise. They were married, the week before. Even American citizens that had flown in, that were Afghan but American citizens and flown in to get married and were enjoying honeymoons and things like that. And then the next day, the government collapsed and people were trapped. So that led to a massive evacuation. And by the end of the month, the last troops had left Kabul, and along with 79,000 Afghans. I'll get to some of the details of the evacuation in a minute, but some other details of just, common facts about Afghanistan. It's a country made up of, at least as of 2019, 38 million people inside the country and 3 million outside. About 42% are Pashtun, and then there's 27% are Tajik. It's the Tajik people that are leading the resistance against the Taliban, but not all Tajiks. But the resistance currently is led by Tajiks. And then there's other groups of people, Uzbeks, Amaks, Turkmens, Balaks, and other groups of people. Dari and Pashto are the two main languages, but there's numerous other languages spoken in the country. Dari is very similar to Farsi or Persian, spoken with a little bit different accent, but Dari and Farsi-speaking people can tend to understand each other. 90% of the country is Sunni Muslim and 7% are Shia Muslim. And most of the people live in rural communities, and there are 34 provinces. So a lot of these things I learned just from interviewing people too. So the details of the evacuation. So as I said before, the evacuation, the collapse of the government happened on August 15th, 2021. And when the Taliban just very quickly came into Kabul, and it fell very quickly, there was really no resistance. And then between the 14th and the 31st, the US started evacuating people with all of these airlifts, and they evacuated 123,000 people through the airlifts from Kabul's airport. 79,000 Afghans were evacuated, and out of those 79,000, 3,200 came to Washington State. I believe Washington State received the fourth highest number of Afghans in the country. And King County received the most out of those of all the counties in the state. We have traditionally had one of the highest Afghan populations, and we have been resettling Afghans for a very long time here throughout the war for the last 20 years, and then in the previous wars that have happened there too. So we have a base Afghan population here that has is one of the reasons, why people, are coming to join where they have contacts. And so that's why they get sent here. And we have a number of refugee resettlement organizations that help them. Also, there were more people arriving than there was capacity for the refugee resettlement organizations. So the government got creative and they started a private partnership program, which was this welcome circle model, like Plymouth got involved with, which was basically groups of private citizens coming together. You had to have, I think, a minimum of 5 people coming together, agreeing to sponsor a family, and it required raising a certain amount of money and agreeing to stick with the family for 90 days. And there was a checklist of things that you had to do to sponsor them and basically help them get settled here. Though of all the sponsor circles I know, everybody has stayed with their families much longer than 90 days. And we've been with ours since February 14th, and I don't see it slowing down anytime soon. So, yeah. A little bit more about the evacuations. There was complete chaos at the Kabul airport. A lot of family separation. I'm sure you heard the stories. There was that bombing that was horrific. About 180 people were killed. It was just, there was a lot of Taliban people that were intermingled with the crowds, and the crowds were just, massive amounts of people. A lot of people were very scared with their documents and were hiding their documents, but they were needing their documents in order to be able to get in, to show that they had a U.S. connection. Those getting in needed to show that they either had worked for the Americans, or had a contract with the Americans, or had family in the U.S. or something like that. And yet, if they were caught with those documents by the Taliban, they could be killed. So it was just really chaotic and crazy there. And people had their children, people were crushed. And it was often that, they would open a door very little bit, and one member of the family would get through and the rest would be left behind. I've had a number of clients where, the younger ones might have gotten through, or the teenagers got through, and the rest of the family didn't. So we've had separated children, very different than like the separated children that happened at our southern border. This was separated just because of the chaos and the massive amounts of people that were happening there. So there are still people working in different organizations trying to reunify these families. And the State Department collects lists of the people that were left behind and works through channels to try to get them reunified by, like, for example, there'll be these private groups that collect the names, and then they give them to the State Department. The State Department verifies it, and then they give the names to the countries of Qatar or Dubai, and they do evacuation flights a couple times a week and bring them to the air bases in their countries where those people live until they can get refugee status there and be brought to the United States. So there's a lot of coordination that happens that way. But initially what happened is they would get in, once they got into the airport, then they would spend a few days getting processed and being led from room to room to room. And then they would eventually make it onto a transport plane, which looked like this scene inside a plane. And then they were flown outside the country. Usually they would have a stop for a few hours in Germany or Dubai or Qatar. And or sometimes they would stay there for a few days. And then they would take them and fly them to the United States, usually stopping first in Washington, D.C. or Philadelphia, and then getting on to a new flight and sending them to a U.S. military base. At those U.S. military bases, they set up huge tents, and the families lived there for 1 to 6 months at a time. It was really tough for some of the families, and many of them had health issues. Many were pregnant and delivering babies or having miscarriages because of the stress. What they were basically doing were waiting to get assigned to a resettlement agency and get flown to where they were going to be resettled. Many of the people couldn't stand the wait at the bases, and so they would walk off the base and just, go and resettle themselves. And the problem with that was, if they did that, they would not receive resettlement services, or it would put them at the back of the line. So they couldn't get resettlement services until everybody else was off of the base, and then a resettlement agency could help them. So it was, a tough situation that way. But eventually, the idea was that they get assigned to a resettlement agency, the government would fly them to their new community, and then they would start the resettlement process. Resettlement process would include, helping them find housing, getting them in school, signing them up for public benefits, making sure that they got their documents in order and their social security numbers and all the many things that it takes to get started here. And like I said, the evacuation process quietly continued for people that were left behind, though, it slowed way down. And for most people, they left a lot of family behind. Sometimes only the dad in a family was allowed to come, and they would leave a spouse and maybe 9 or 10 kids behind, which, is just really heartbreaking. So, the one thing that is really, really different for this whole group of refugees is, first of all, this is the first time in U.S. history that we've basically evacuated the refugees from a sort of war time situation directly to the United States, or with a very short period of time in some other place, and then to the United States. You think about refugees being in refugee camps for a long period of time and being processed, for years at a time and being processed, and then coming to the United States. There are many other refugee groups where they might stay in a refugee camp for 20 years and then come to the United States, something like that. But these went directly from the traumatic situation as their government is collapsing and came to the United States. So that's one very large difference. The second is they did not enter the United States in refugee status. Refugee status gives you a person all sorts of benefits. It's a permanent status, and it's on a path to permanency. Basically, when you enter the United States as a refugee, you are allowed to live here. In a year, you are allowed to apply for your green card, and then you, in a few years, are allowed to apply to become a U.S. citizen. You can get jobs, you get benefits, and you can, just get to focus on building your life, rebuilding your life without having to worry about what is your immigration status. And you can also think about getting reunified with family, because refugees are allowed to bring like spouses and children and bring your family together again. With the Afghans, they didn't get that. They were brought here in emergency humanitarian parole status. And it was just a temporary status. Some of them initially got it for 1 year, and most of them got it for 2 years. They were given work permission, and they were given some benefits, some of the other resettlement benefits, like assistance to find their housing, and public benefits like food stamps and medical and things like that. But it's not a permanent status. And so they have to think about their immigration situation, and have to worry about it, and have to figure out what they're going to do. And they all have to apply for some kind of immigration benefit. So it put all of the refugee resettlement agencies and all the immigrant rights organizations in a real bind, because all of a sudden there was a huge number of people in need of having their cases looked at. And these are people with no money to hire attorneys or anything like that, and they're complicated cases. So they all had to be analyzed and have individual interviews and figure out, are they eligible to apply for something that's called a special immigrant visa, which is for people who worked with Americans and for the American government, and you have to have all sorts of documents to prove that. And they evacuated in a rush and had to destroy so much in order to protect their families. Or do they qualify for asylum because they have a fear that they would be persecuted, which most of them do have that, but asylum applications are very lengthy and take a lot of time to prepare. So that's something that is a real big challenge right now, and has caused a lot of stress to these families. Congress, when they originally were evacuating them, there was a lot of talk like, oh, don't worry, we're going to figure it out. When you get here, we're going to fix it. We're going to pass the Afghan Adjustment Act. We're going to get a way for you to stay here permanently. But that all stalled and didn't get passed. So then everybody started looking for other ways to do it. And last fall, plus they left a lot of family behind. So last fall, people filed thousands and thousands of applications called these humanitarian parole applications for their family that they left behind, which is about the only way that they could ask for help for family members. And each of those applications had a $545 filing fee per individual. So if you have a family of 10, and Afghans have large families, that's a lot of money for them. And people were filing those, and the vast majority of those were getting denied, like 90-something%. So big waste of money. What was kind of interesting is, or very sad, is there's another refugee crisis that has happened in this past year with the Ukrainians. And fortunately for the Ukrainians, which was the way that I really wish it had happened for the Afghans, and it's great for the Ukrainians, is that the government passed some or put together some programs so that Ukrainians can apply for humanitarian parole. There is no application fee. They're processing them very quickly, and they're approving almost all of them. So it's a very, very, very different situation of how they're handling Afghan cases and what they're doing for Ukrainians. So, yeah. So I want to talk a little bit about the challenges now that they're for the people that are here, and what the teams that are supporting them are doing, how they're working with them. So a lot of the challenges, the biggest one probably is housing, especially in our area. Housing is so expensive. And also, housing is not built for the family sizes that we see Afghans arriving in. And, you know, we used to have families in the United States. My mom comes from a family of that had 6 kids in it. And the family that the Plymouth Welcome Circle resettled, it has 6 kids in it. And, there are houses out there that can that used to put 6 kids in them, but we just don't seem to have them in the Seattle area anymore. People won't rent to a family of 8 anymore. Or you can't find a house that will charge enough that, a single income earner will be able to afford anymore. So that's a big thing. Another big thing is because of the chaos, there were massive mistakes on documents. Birth dates were put 10 years younger or 10 years older, or things like that. So kids can't get into school, or elders can't get the proper benefits that they need because they look like they're too young on the document, things like that. And their names are just massacred in the spellings. There's also a big difference in how documents are recorded in Afghanistan. Traditionally, marriages are not recorded in Afghanistan, and you don't always have a marriage certificate, or if you do, it might be just a certificate that it's like a fancy paper that's got the blanks.
Hi, it's Mary Margaret. Are you watching Janet Gwilym on 370?
There are different certificates that you can purchase and then fill the blanks in, but you don't actually record them in a government office. And so you don't have proof from a government agency that somebody's been married. They might have a lot of kids, but they don't have proof that they've been married. So we've had these discussions in the office, like, oh, maybe we should have a group marriage ceremony and get some friends that are judges and get their marriages recorded to work in the US system or something like that. We've also learned, just helping out families, that our best benefit systems don't really truly support people. There you have to go through so much bureaucracy and red tape to get things done. And then, supporting their families back home. There's massive famine and starvation, and nobody is working right now. And so not only are they trying to support their family here, but they're also trying to support their family back home and send money back home. So they might be supporting 10 people here and 10 people back there. It's really, really challenging. And as I said before, yeah, we're just not built for large families anymore. There's a lack of interpreters, especially for Dari and Pashto in our systems, and not with such an influx of Afghans in new areas. Some of our school systems aren't used to working with Afghan kids, and so they don't have the ELL teachers that teach Afghan kids. Mary Margaret can talk to you about dental issues. She is an expert in making dental appointments for Afghans. That's a big thing, coming from a country that doesn't have fluoridated water, and nobody goes to the dentist as a child. So lots of dental appointments. And then coming straight from the trauma, you're dealing with highly traumatized populations. They may have been working. A lot of the Afghans that were resettled here were working with the US forces and were clearing mines from roads, or working with, actual fighting the Taliban or things like that, and experienced trauma in multiple forms. So, and then the actual evacuation caused a lot of trauma. So thinking about all of those issues as we're trying to resettle them. But I don't want to leave you on such a downer kind of thing, because there are so many gifts and so much joy that they bring to us. Because it has been so much fun. Especially, you know, my work is I interview people day in, day out on trying to pull out their story for their asylum cases and things like that. But so it's the bad stuff. But when I get to work in the welcome circle and sit and talk with the family that we're working with, that's where the real fun comes out, and we really get to know them. There's an incredible Afghan hospitality. You can't go there for just a short drop in and rush out type of visit. You always sit down, you get served tea. There's many versions of the tea. And I've learned a lot of different ways to making tea. And lots of little snacky treats and things like that. Sometimes they'll cook you a whole meal, and then you just take time to sit and talk. I lived in China a long time ago, and it was the same kind of thing there, where people would stop by and you just sit and talk, and you know, that slower pace of life. And this has been reminders of that, and it's been wonderful. There's a lot of hope for their daughters and for education. I hear that from all Afghans. That's what they're excited about here, and really get into making sure that their daughters are getting educated, and the daughters are expressing really great aspirations to be doctors, to be pilots, and all sorts of fun professions that way. Their faith is interwoven into everything they do, and it really makes them resilient. Yeah, just their whole life exudes, everything is connected into their faith. Our family wakes up very early in the morning, and they do teaching of the Quran with the older kids, both in the morning and in the evening. Very, very important to them. And then the kids will be kids. It's so much fun. They play games. There's rock, paper, scissors games, that things that they've learned that, you know, that it's so funny that games that they know that we know, and that just even a 3-year-old has picked up that is so much fun. So, and they love to watch how things grow. And when for a while, our family was living up on Beacon Hill. We're not too far from where I live. And every time I went over there, I had to get a tour of every single seed they had planted in the garden, and a long discussion of every seed and how much it had sprouted, things like that. So it's really great. Their food is so good. I've learned that halal rules are not just about meat. It's about other things too, and just how animals are cared for in multiple ways. Things that have made me very frustrated might make them frustrated too, but they're pretty experienced with red tape in their own culture and society. So they've taught me some patience. I've also learned that our medical systems are not designed for families, because our medical systems that are serving low-income families only allow for 2 appointments at a time. So you cannot take multiple people, which just, you know, you can't take a whole family in. And so it just makes it really hard for when you have just one person driving in a family, who is also the person that is working in the family, has to take a lot of time off to you know, take their kids to appointments, and hopefully they have a flexible job to do that. Our public benefits, that kind of goes with it too. Our public benefits systems are just very inflexible and complicated, and hard for English-speaking Americans to understand, let alone non-English-speaking Afghans. So, and then I had a really interesting, funny conversation with an Afghan man that contracts at my work, who had a very high-powered job in Afghanistan, and he's brilliant in this job. He was high-level government, but he's just perplexed at the household management skills that he has to have here, because in Afghanistan, you live in multi-generational extended family households. It's not just, multi-generational, but you have your brothers and sisters' families living with you too. You're living in these big groups. And so you always have somebody available to help out with different things, and to help take care of your kids and help do different tasks and things like that. And so when you are picked up from that and plunked down in the US, not knowing how to do things, and you have to suddenly take on all of those tasks, oftentimes the men might be the only ones that speak English in the household. And so everything gets, targeted on them. It gets really complicated real fast for them. So that was a kind of eye-opening experience for me that way too. But there's a lot of joking around about it, and we get through it and stuff. So yeah, but it has been a lot of fun, and I do want to take a few minutes, see if anybody has any questions. Is it possible for people to unmute and ask questions, Sally, or?
Yes, it is. And I'll
Okay.
start with the question. Do they have interpreters for their medical appointments? Because I have a friend who is a Farsi interpreter for medical.
Yeah.
A company that does medical interpretations.
Oh, that's great. Yeah.
So
Yes.
do they have, or do most families have someone who speaks English?
Yeah. So most families don't necessarily have someone who speaks English, or their English isn't necessarily good enough to do like medical interpretation. So the doctor's offices are they're required to call for a medical interpreter. Now, that doesn't always work, because those the telephone interpreters, sometimes they don't speak the right dialect, or they don't get connected right, or just phone interpretation in general can be kind of wonky. So it doesn't always work. With our particular family, we have had, for some of our appointments, and Mary Margaret, you can fill me in a little bit on this too, because I know you've heard the stories, but my understanding is sometimes some of the other members of our welcome circle have taken them to the appointments, and then they've called the medical interpreter, and that hasn't worked out so well. So we try to get the dad who speaks more English to go to the appointments as well. Plus he kind of knows what the issues are and the questions that we want to make sure are asked. So yeah, Mary Margaret.
I would be interested in having you comment on your experience through all these years. And I don't need to tell the audience that your experience and your expertise have been absolutely a phenomenal help in the one family that I have observed you working. So thank you for that. But anyway, would you comment on what your experience has been in the United States and Washington State particularly, relating to the fact that this family and many of the families, I presume, are very devout Muslims?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and they definitely are. Yeah, and that, like I was saying, their faith is just so intertwined with everything they do. And the like the children in our family really, they wanted to be sure that they were going to be allowed to pray at school. And, you know, Seattle Public Schools does have prayer rooms available in all their schools, or at least the ones in the south end of Seattle. And the schools were very open to that. And they got to know who their other Muslim classmates were, and, you know, would go to prayer time in school. You know, it was pretty important to figure out where the mosque was and what prayer time was there. We you know, made sure we've learned a lot about the two Eids, the main Eids holidays, the one that happens after Ramadan and the one that happens after Hajj, you know, the going to Mecca, which just happened a couple weeks ago. And the kids are, you know, the kids talk all the time about what it means to be Muslim. I've met so many Muslim or so many Afghan women who have the Quran memorized from front to back, and they did that when they were like 13 years old. It seems to be that the women tend to do it more than the men, but some of the men have done that as well. And it's just very important. Call to prayer happens all the time on their phones. I'll be in the middle of an appointment and the call to prayer come on. They don't usually interrupt their appointments at work to do it, to pray, but when I'm visiting, they will say, oh, hang on, I'm gonna go pray, and then they'll come back. Stuff like that. But yeah, their faith is just integral to everything.
And no harassment at school.
Not where they go to school, because there's so many Muslims of other cultures there. Yeah, but I would imagine, you know, if other communities, they probably would be, but yeah, there's a lot of Muslims up on Beacon Hill, so. Yeah.
Janet, are there any remaining channels open with the current Afghan government to in any way put the families back together that were separated in that chaos in October? Is there any hope of that?
Yeah, so what I have heard, and a lot of my my source is, I'm working right now with 3 contractors that are all Afghan men. 2 of them were educated. The University of Washington Law School used to have an Afghan program. They had an LLM degree, a master's degree in law, that they used to bring Afghan scholars over into that program. They were often professors in the law schools in Afghanistan, or judges and things like that, and they would come for 2 years and then go back to Afghanistan. One of them is a professor at SPU right now, and the other one was in that program, and then he returned to Afghanistan and taught law, and he also worked in refugee services over there. And they're doing contract work with us right now to interview. And then there's a third one that's working for us, and he only has been here for a few months. And he used to work for the Office of the President in Afghanistan, but he has a master's in law, or master's in international relations, and a bachelor's in law from Afghanistan and Pakistan. But he was evacuated several months after. So he was living with the Taliban. And his name was on a list. Somehow the US government, they kept a list of all the people that had special immigrant visas that were working with the government and had already applied for the special immigrant visa. There's a special category for people who had worked with the US government. so special visa category. And so they had him, and he was evacuated by the government of Qatar. So he went to Qatar and then stayed there for a couple months, and then was brought to the United States. His brother was then evacuated after him, and his brother is now in Qatar, and he's waiting for his brother to be brought here. And we've heard about this happening several times. And so he's kind of my source, because he's keeping his ear to the ground with all these different groups that get their names on, somehow get their names on this Department of State list, that then the Department of State talks to the government of Qatar or the government of Dubai and gets them out. So they're going through these backdoor channels to get people out, but they're doing it in a very organized manner of, first it has to be people, they first went through the list of everybody and their families of who was approved for these visas. Then they started working on those who had applied but have yet to be approved for these visas. And then they're going to go through the family members left behind. Something like that is what I've heard. So,
Thank you.
yeah. But when you're talking about family members, the heartbreaking part is it's minor children and spouses. And the hard part is, for so many of them, they're thinking about their siblings, which don't count. And they might have minor siblings or unmarried siblings. And in Afghanistan, if you there's supposed to be an adult male in the household, and especially under the Taliban, it's very important to have an adult male in the household. And many of them, the adult male was the one that got out. And if it's their wife is left with young children, or some of them, it's like their father passed away and their widowed mother is left there, and maybe their unmarried brother is living there, and they don't have a way to get them out. Yeah.
Janet, you mentioned the difference between the United States systems for Afghan refugees versus Ukrainian refugees. But there are dozens, hundreds of other places that people are trying to get to the United States from, or sneaking into the United States from. And I wonder what your experience is on the rationality of the United States immigration, the irrationality of the United States immigration system, and the kinds of things that people like us could do to help.
The irrationality of the United States immigration system, yeah, it's it really is. I don't even know where to start. Yeah. Yeah, with the, I hate to kind of pit one immigrant group against another immigrant group. And my Ukrainian colleagues would say the same thing. They recognize also, because they understand immigration very well too. I have Ukrainian representatives on staff with me, and they know how hard it's been on the Afghans versus, it's horrible for their own families left in Ukraine, and their families are getting bombed and everything too. And they've been, the Ukrainian community was just amazing in how they rallied together and have gotten so many people out. And, no fault to them that they put their resources together to make it happen. But I don't want to go backwards for them in any way, but there's something there that, why would the government, first what happened was, we have our southern border closed off still, right? And not allowing people in, but suddenly,
it's a southern border that's closed, but it seems to be porous.
Exactly. Yeah. And so first what happened was Ukrainians showed up and they paroled them in. They wouldn't parole anybody else in. And I talked to Ukrainians that came in just days after the war broke out, and I was interviewing them, days apart each time, and what it was like. And so I first talked to Ukrainians when nobody was there yet. They had to be pointed out which way to the border. And then I talked to
they're coming in through the Mexican, from Mexico to the United States, but they're Ukrainians.
They first before the US had any systems set up, they first were just going to the border and saying, hey, I want asylum, I need to leave Ukraine. And they were letting them in. They were paroling them in. No questions asked. And anybody else who would have done that, they would have at the very best detained them, but most people they would just turn away. And then they set up a whole program where they started just saying, okay, we'll just parole every Ukrainian in. And so they started hearing about that, and the Ukrainian churches all got together and sent massive people down into Mexico, and they rented out all of these hotels, and they lined everybody up and got them all organized, and they had buses, and they brought them to and they had food and water, and then they, on the other side, once they got in, they had their plane tickets ready, and they got them to where they were going, and it was amazing ways. And then after that, the US started the Uniting for Ukraine program, where they got the free humanitarian parole applications going. And so they stopped doing it at the border, the southern border, and they announced that they were going to stop it because they had started this other program. But Ukrainians all along have gotten a way in, and it was just crazy. But I don't fault them for that, and they are definitely war, refugees of war, and have had horrible things happening.
But we are not welcoming Syrians the way we are welcoming either Ukrainians or Afghans.
We're not.
Muslims perhaps of a different type of Islam, but system doesn't work for that.
Yeah, and we're definitely not welcoming Afghans, except the ones that worked for the US, and they have to jump through a lot of hoops. I mean, it's a very small number compared to the ones that are eligible. So
refugees from Syria.
They're refugees from Syria. They have to go through the refugee process. So there's some Syrians coming in, but a very small number. Yeah. I know some Afghans and Syrians that are sharing a house right now. But yeah.
Well, I have become aware of a particular couple of Latino men who are from one of the countries that the United States thinks is a communist or socialist dictatorship. And so they were welcomed in across the Mexican border. And they have found, because of their other people they know who speak the same language and maybe we're from the same country, there's a whole system of employment for people and ways of getting them money, even though the banking system doesn't, wants to know their social security numbers. But the United States has somehow managed to have all kinds of things under the radar of people like me. And yet we do various different people differently. And Latinos who come from a government that we do not consider to be socialist dictators don't have the same kind of welcome.
Yeah.
I just wondered your comments on that.
Yeah. No, it's very, very uneven, and yeah.
Okay, I think at this time our time is coming to a close, unless there's another burning question, but we just want to thank you so much. And the reasons you pointed out of people being treated differently is why we have a diversity committee here.
Mhm.
So, and an awareness, and we thank you so much for your wonderful insights, but most of all for your work and who you are. And we'll look forward to having you back again. So
Great, thank
with
you.
that, we say thank you.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
everybody. And this will be replayed on August the 2nd, a Tuesday at 7:30. It will be on the upcoming alert next week.
Oh,
Thank
wow.
you
Okay,
again
great.
so
Thank you.
much, Janet, for
Thank you,
such a
Janet.
wonderful program.
Okay, take care, everybody.
You.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.